Hey everyone, good to see you. She said super energetic. I don't know what phase of jet lag I'm in from San Francisco, but I'll do my best. It's good to see you all again, and excited to host this kind of panel on business priorities and user needs and the balance between them. I wanted to kick things off with maybe like an icebreaker question to the panel to kind of get to know each other a little better while they introduce themselves. So maybe first, if you could, we'll go down the line and share, your name, what you work on, and if you were in a different industry, what would you want to be in? Like if you, either when you were growing up or later, whatever, like a different possible job, which one you might want to be in. So we'll start from the end with Alex and then kind of go down toward me.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex Race and I look after customer digital products for Maersk, a worldwide, probably the biggest shipping company in the world. I had 20 years in UX, head of UX and design at British Gas, and over the last 5 years I've been complete head of digital over at Maersk. If I was to be anything else, I'd be a writer. I'd be a penniless writer, but I would still be a writer, so yeah, that would be me.
Hi, my name is Josie, and I'm a global head of research and research operations at SumUp, and we build solutions for merchants to run and business and grow their business successfully. A big part of my role is really helping teams to figure out how to use research insights to help inform decisions and build better products. If I would be something else, my first plan was probably to be a truck driver. I do not know why, but I had a big admiration for...
I can help you there.
Wonderful, maybe we could come up with something later. But since that was banned very early on, then I believe I would be a vet. I have this tendency to pick up animals everywhere I go, so I would probably end up having either some kind of vet clinic or a probably house full of animals.
That's great. I can't imagine what a vet conference would be like, actually. That would be pretty cool to see different animals where we can. Go ahead.
Yeah, Paul Pryor, and I'm vocational about bringing entrepreneurial thinking to corporate environments. So my background is 2 fintechs, 3 advisory firms, 3 continents. Is probably the best way to describe it. And I wouldn't do anything else.
Really?
Yeah, I love what I do, so very passionate about it. So I'm one of these lucky people who kind of knew what direction I wanted to go at a fairly young age. So I understand that to be to make me a very lucky person.
Wow, that's great. And I'll introduce myself really quick as well, and then we'll get into a couple questions. And I'd like to leave it 5-10 minutes if we can for your questions as well to kind of keep it participatory. So yeah, I'm Noah. I lead the design team at Figma. We work on a bunch of products, Figma, FigJam, Community, things like that. I joined about 5 years ago. It's been really cool to see that journey evolve over time. If I were something else, I think I should have thought of my own answer to this. I would say either a teacher of some kind would be kind of fun. I don't know what I would teach or what I could teach, but something like that's kind of interesting. I used to do a lot of theater, so maybe that. Maybe something in theater as well would be kind of fun. But I like the vet idea as well. I have a dog at home and getting lots of pictures from my girlfriend and definitely feeling like, oh, I miss my dog. Okay. So enough about that. Let's talk about business and user priorities and that balance. There's no way to really segue from that, so I'm just going to do it. So I have just a couple questions here, and we'll kind of just make this interactive. We can go down the line either way. But to start, these are obviously like tricky balances to have in a company. You're dealing with realizing that you need to make money, you need to profit in general in some way. But you also, of course, have these customer needs that come up, and they may not always align with things that, that your business needs kind of might have. And so regularly in our positions in UX, regardless of exactly what our industry is, we're probably having to deal with that tension. And ideally, maybe it's not a tension and they're complementary, but that doesn't always show up that way. And so the first question is just, with that, how do you balance it? Like, is it a balance? What does that look like for each of you? And yeah, happy to start again with Alex and kind of go down, and we'll go from there.
Yes, I think during the 20 years I was doing UX, it was very much, obviously, I was customer-driven, totally customer-focused. Lived in that world where I could concentrate 100%. And then over the last 5 years, as I've gained ownership of that full technology stack, it becomes a little bit more politicized, and you realize you have to make compromises, right? It's part of survival, I think, and it's part of running kind of not only a UX organization, but a technology one. I think As long as you're getting a balance over your product life cycle, and when I talk about product life cycle, I mean from everything like ideation through to the moment you choose to sunset that product, there should be a balance throughout the product life cycle. But at each stage of that product life cycle, your weighting is going to change, right? So during ideation and growth of a product, you're going to have more focus on the customer side. But once you have a product that's fully matured and you're kind of ready to ditch it, then use it as a cash cow. Your customer needs are less. Rinse that to get your money for the business to reinvest in your new products.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I feel like a lot of companies, even Google, for example, Google Search obviously generated a ton of revenue for the company, and they could reinvest that revenue in these earlier life cycle projects you're mentioning, and maybe the balance there is, it's almost like when you receive investment money for something, you can all of a sudden have this freedom to kind of explore a market fit and see where it goes and figure out your business plan along the way. It's super interesting. Yeah, feel free to take this wherever you want if any of you have anything that comes to mind with this balance.
I would actually like to think of it more of having it be in synergy, right? Because balance in itself says it's one or the other, right? So is it only user needs or is it only business needs, right? But most often we are actually striving to have them be in synergy of a sort where we could use those user needs and have them be an input for what is that we want to build. So what is that solution should be, or what solution we are building, and what that solution indeed should be, in a way that it's also benefiting our business needs. Now, of course, it's not always too easy to have it that way, but anytime when I think of a balance, it is like, oh, do I do a little bit of this, or a little bit of that?
I can actually think of an example of that. I used to work at a company called ClassPass, which was like a fitness company. You would buy this monthly subscription. And one of the things I always found super interesting is, you would think if classes were free, you could just go and it'd be fine, you would just want to do that. But it turned out paying, which the business needed, was actually kind of surprisingly aligned with people, because if they put money down, they would actually work out because they didn't want to waste the money. And so it was this kind of interesting business model dynamic where, like, ideally it would be a good thing because you would wake up in the morning and there would be even a cancellation fee was really contentious. People would be like, I don't want to pay to cancel last minute. But then you would talk more with customers about it and they'd be like, well, you know what? Like, if it weren't there, I probably wouldn't have worked out. And if I didn't work out, I wouldn't feel good. So that's maybe a fun example where the synergy kind of did land in that case. But I think it is hard to have that in a lot of companies where your customers, if they were asked, would you want to pay, would probably say no a lot of the time. But maybe that's not true. I don't know. What do you think? Yeah,
it's always interesting when you're asked these questions because you kind of get a visualization that we all sit in rooms pontification about these kind of things. But, it's great to have the time and space to think about what we do in our daily role. I think there's two things. Like, firstly is, whose job is it to consider all these elements? And for me, I think as leaders within organizations, we probably carry the burden of the philosophy of each of those three elements. So if you look at it from a user perspective, the way I like to think about it is psychology and neuroscience, and that's human beings. So first item that I would walk through with the team is stop thinking about it as an interaction with something that's physical or quantifiable and start thinking about it as an interaction you'd have with a conversation you'd have in real life, right? So that's back to the point of synergies as opposed to balance. Then secondly, when it comes to product, we spend most of our time trying to manage the constraints and limitations that we have to work through from a product perspective. And I always find it interesting when, and I love hearing from companies, by the way, so please reach out. But when they do reach out and kind of say, I've been looking through your website and I noticed this visual image is motor loading on this page, etc. And you're just like, shut up. Like, I've spent 18 months in a boardroom trying to convince them to update the infrastructure so that I can make that change. So for me, product, the balance is really around the limitations and constraints that underpin that. And then the business is really the circle that underpins, or the circle that encapsulates both of those elements. And I think as leaders, it's probably important for us to have individuals within our teams that have responsibility for each of those elements. And then we play the role of the philosopher, if you want to put it that way, of balancing them across the tree.
So what, with that though, like what is the responsibility to make profit here? Like what do we have to do? How do you think about that aspect of it in your day job?
Yeah, so hands up anyone who's heard of Elon Musk. No one put their hand up. That's strange, isn't it? Has anyone heard of Sam Childers? No, I heard no one say anything. Like, the society we live in at the moment is really interesting, Our ability to be influenced by marketing over competence is starting to get a bit ridiculous. So Sam Childers was a member of the Hells Angels, actually, by birth, and he grew into a family that was big bikers. And he spent most of his penultimate adult years robbing banks and selling drugs, right, which is really interesting. But probably that's what I should have answered in my first
Another job, yeah, there you go.
now that I'm thinking about it. But certainly profitable. But he like most people seem to, who move towards philanthropy, he found God, right? Now, we won't talk about that today, but, and he started a contracting company out in East Africa, in particular in North and South Sudan, when it was one country. And he's come to know one of the most impactful philanthropists on the planet. And the reason I'm talking about this, by the way, I am going to come back to a point, is I was listening to a podcast, because he's someone I'm very interested in, and I was listening to a podcast recently where he's being interviewed about profitability, and he said, like, I think the interviewer asked, like, I'm sure you don't think about money and what you're there to kind of save the world, and he said, are you fucking joking me? Like, he said, without money, I wouldn't be able to create the level of support that I'm able to create within the environment. And he put it down to, if I tried to do this on a budget, I wouldn't be able to affect 90% of the children that I'm able to affect. So, like, I should say what he works with former child soldiers and reprograms them to be more, to have a more realistic view of life, for want of a better phrase. And I think that's a really good way to think about your organization. Like, at the end of the day, we're human beings, and if you see my talk online, if you get the chance to look at it, I talk about organizations are the only place where you take thousands of people that probably don't even like each other and would never hang out with each other, and ask them all to row in the same direction. So I think thinking about what we do in very human terms, and one of the interview questions I often ask, is some of my team are here, so they'll know I probably asked this to some of them, was, what's your legacy going to be? Because you're going to leave your job, and many of us move on from the companies that we're working for. So what you want to be able to say about yourself and be proud about in the end, and I think as long as you remain grounded to that, you'll make good decisions for the organizations that you're working for. That's my opinion anyway. So.
Yeah, it's not like you'll be on your deathbed and think about, like, what did you do in the world, and be like, well, I made a ton of money. It's probably more like, what did that allow you to do, or how did that change society, or what were the outcomes from that? It's just sort of a means to an end. That's a refreshing perspective. I think a lot of times in our field, we're kind of like, oh, well, does it need to make a profit? But yeah, it's a huge part of how we interact every day. It's a big, it's a good perspective.
But it will make a profit. It's a byproduct of having the right mindset, right?
Any other thoughts on sort of how profit shows up in either of your jobs, or how it comes into the conversation either directly in something that you're doing or in a trade-off you had to manage through your company? Anything that comes to mind? Yeah.
So I think, so I work with basically trucking, right? I go out to places like Mobile in Alabama, and I try and persuade 60-year-old Chuck, who's been driving to the same terminal 6 times a day for the last 30 years, to use a new mobile app to check in and out of the terminal when his mate Bud is waving him through, regardless of whether he's using the app or not, right? And he's got this bloodhound on the passenger seat, and it's good stuff, right? But in my head, it's operational efficiency, right? In the trucking and the logistics industry, it's operational efficiency, and it is about being able to get shipping containers out of the port and getting them onto the road as quickly as possible, right? That saves the people shipping the goods money, it saves us money as a corporation, but increasingly it helps decarbonization, right? And that is massively important to Maersk, because we are on a decarbonization journey as one of the world's biggest consumers of fuel. So whereas everyone else talks about profit, I like to say, we've got to increase operational efficiency, because in turn that will have so many other benefits to society over and above just money that are still quantifiable.
Yeah, that's a good point. It also sort of makes me think about how it's not just sort of generating money for a company. You're also thinking about, you have resources in your company, and if you're more efficient in that company, whether through your processes or other kinds of things you're doing, that's another way to sort of profit, in the sense that you're enabling yourself to do more. It's kind of just a different trade-off. That's a good point. Any other last thoughts on sort of like when that shows up for you at work, if at all? If that, yeah.
Well, something I've observed quite often, especially in the research field and designs as well, is that we get so focused on user needs, we need to do what's right for the user. And for the most part, yes, we just talked yesterday about how companies that are really customer-centric actually on the long run are much more successful than those that prioritize financial gains on the short run. But something that we really don't, from my experience, don't give enough attention to in a research and design community is that ultimately we need to make this product successful. We need to either get paying customers or we need to have another way to monetize, because otherwise we as a company, we are not going to continue to exist, right? So it's really about keeping attention to that balance. And although we can be working more on the user side of things, but we should not lose sight of, okay, what do we actually need in order to continue existing as a company? Because at the end of the day, we are all humans, we all need to get paid, we have our hobbies, we have stuff to do. So it's also something that I'm not saying we should always necessarily prioritize, but we should not lose sight of that.
Yeah, that reminds me even of what Alex was saying in the beginning about the sort of the timeline or the context of the conversation you're having. And in the early stages, yeah, it's like you're saying, it's what are we actually trying to accomplish? What does the product need to be successful? That is a lot more important at that stage. Making money on day one may not be. It's just finding whatever people say about your first 1,000 customers that are really excited and passionate about your product in some way. Like that becomes the goal. Whereas sometimes mid to late stages, maybe pre-IPO for some companies, whatever, yeah, the conversation does have to shift to like, is this the most profitable product for us? Will the shareholders believe that? There are these changes that happen depending on where you are in that cycle. So super interesting stuff. Gonna maybe shift gears to another kind of question here, but sort of related in other ways as well. Are there ever moments where any of you have had to kind of like actually deal with a trade-off somewhere where you were advocating for a customer need and someone else in the room maybe like didn't, you just either had a different perspective or weren't able to internalize that customer need? Like, a lot of our jobs is advocating for some experience we think should happen in the world or something someone's saying. Was there just anything that comes to mind in a moment where you needed to like just position that customer need? It could be presenting research, it could be whatever comes to mind, anything.
So I think there's a great example. So we're looking at the stats on our website, and we're seeing that huge amounts of traffic coming into a page that allows you to track and trace a container, a shipping container. A bit like your Amazon parcel, right? But we couldn't make all the different metrics fit. And it turned out that our customers were creating bots. They were creating these like scripts to basically pummel our website to get back all this information on containers. And it was trucking companies, it was dispatchers, people like that were scraping our site for data. And we're like, hey, there's customer demand here, right? They don't want our user interface. They want our data, right? So we have got an opportunity here for a commercial product. Because if we can produce monetized APIs that people pay a subscription fee for, they can take our APIs, they can integrate them with their systems, they don't need to scrape our site, they get what they want, we get revenue, and it's great. And so from looking at that data and being able to cross-correlate, what the behavior was, who was doing what, we were able to take that and create a really innovative product, which is now our paid-for APIs. There was a downside to that, though, because the traffic to our website crashed completely, and then I had to answer why we'd lost like a quarter of our website traffic. And I'd say, it's a good news story, honestly. It's because we're now selling them data. I'm not sure they bought it, but yeah, it was a good news story.
That's an interesting example where like the customers are telling you what a business need might actually be, and maybe not directly with words, but through their actions and what they're doing. We had a similar moment too at Figma where the pandemic hit, and we were seeing all this behavior of people using Figma for things that we didn't expect them to use it for, right? We thought most people would be using it for product design strictly, right? You're making wireframes, prototypes, whatever it might be. But all of a sudden, people were like having meetings in Figma, and we were like, what's going on here? Like everyone was kind of just like starting to, draw, like create these custom sticky notes. And from that kind of FigJam was born, right? This whole other product that we didn't expect to build or plan to showed up because our customers kind of came and showed us what they wanted by literally drawing a tool that didn't even really exist yet. And so it's definitely fun to think about like when your customers are kind of like almost a couple steps ahead of you, or the market itself is revealing some trend that could actually also be a business in itself. That's cool. Yeah, any other anecdotes or stories that come to mind for either of you on a moment where your customers did something interesting or taught you something that you had to advocate for, whatever comes to mind.
One of the very early examples from my career working as a user researcher a long time ago, I think it might have been even my very first job. I joined this startup in San Francisco, and we did a lot of research to figure out who they are, what they want, what do we build, where the opportunities are. What are the solutions to be built? And then we went to the CPO. It's like, hey, these are the solutions that we need to build. This is what they want. And they're like, no. I was like, why no? Like, no. This is not exactly what is going to get us where we want to get as a business, right? And something about how we actually get that message across, given who the stakeholder is on the other side, is something that really resonated with me a lot, because I was trying to use a lot of these approaches that I would normally use, like, oh, here is where this need is in the customer journey, here's what they do, here's why, here's how it's going to benefit them. But then I realized that depending on who is on the other side, right, of the conversation, we really need to tailor also how is that we bring this up, because different things or the way you build a case also can resonate in a completely different way, right? So in this case, I was talking to someone who at that point was very much focused on, we need to get from point A to point B, this is what we can afford, this is how we do it. So like, all of that makes sense, but let's really talk about business. So just thinking about how do we get that message across, and what sticks the most is, I would say, one of the strongest learnings I had as a researcher.
There are two things I liked about that. One is that you're almost talking about two customers. You've got the actual customer for the product, but then there's the customer of like the person you're talking to who's trying to make a decision about something. And hopefully that's something that as designers or whatever we're doing, we have that kind of skill set or hopefully superpower to actually learn about them and their own needs as a coworker, as a stakeholder, and leverage that kind of empathy or whatever it might be to like help them understand something through their own lens or something like that. The other part I liked about the beginning part of your story there is that I think a lot of times in conferences and panels discussions, we're always talking about probably moments where it's like, oh, this thing happened and maybe it went super well, or we learned this one customer insight and all of a sudden everything worked. And what we don't often hear is when the customers are like, nope, that didn't work. Like a big failure, a moment that we didn't expect and had to pivot. I've been a part of plenty of projects, both at Google and ClassPass, where we had this hypothesis, we were super excited about it, and we like launched a product and celebrated, you have your launch party, whatever, and then your kind of metrics kind of go flat. Maybe they're not really, maybe day one it goes well, and then all of a sudden, it doesn't stick or something. And those are actually, to me, some of the more interesting stories. Like, what happened there? And when do you need to bring a customer story that's like, hey, I don't know that our customers are happy, or I'm not sure this is working. Those are hard conversations, for sure. Does it have anything like that happen to either of you either, or any stories? Yeah.
Yeah, all the time. So I found your point around the crossing the chasm, which is kind of what you were talking about, which is, where you're either venture capital backed or angel backed, and it's all about customer acquisition and getting to a certain stage. It's usually around 300, 350 people, moving to, which Maersk and I would be very familiar with, a highly regulated industry that now needs risk and control and significant amount of governance around it. And you typically find most startups, in quotes, fall off the cliff around that stage, but equally companies like ours find it really difficult to take what's good about those organizations and bring them forward. So like I promised the guys I'd mention this morning, so here's an example of where I was influenced. So like we were writing a BRS for the next release of a digital transformation, what a word. Digital transformation program that's coming up. And back when I had written it, I just put global search in it. We need some kind of global search thing. And the guys are like, my team are telling me we shouldn't do it this way. The data's telling us that we should have a filter system within the shop. And for me, that's a very straightforward conversation, because you have qualitative and quantitative information. But more important, I trust the competency that's there. So Like, we spent 3 years building their competency. At some stage, you have to go, okay, I'm just going to trust what you're telling me and move on. What disappoints me, though, in that conversation is I'm off at the moment and they're actually waiting for me to make a decision. So that's something that I know I need to work on. I think the concept of customer within organizations like ours is a really difficult one. Like, I entered an organization where their concept of the customer is the regulator kicking me in the ass? Are people complaining about our organization? And we've worked really hard to get them to understand the benefits of having a customer-first approach, and customer meaning the broader sense. Employees are your customers, users are your customers, and people external to your company are customers as well. And the way we did that was we brought in funnel effectiveness, which is our board-level metric, and then 35 KPIs that underpin that go from everywhere from brand health through to advocation, and work through it from that perspective. So.
Yeah, wow. I'm realizing, I had a bunch more questions here, but we only have 7.5 minutes left. I'm looking at the timer, and I want to make sure that we have a chance to talk to all of you and answer questions that come up for you when you're thinking about this balance of what you're hearing from customers and what you think the business needs, these trade-offs that come up, anything that you heard even that we talked about so far that you wanted to learn more about, whatever comes to mind. We've got probably room for maybe 4 questions or so. Usually that's about how much time you'll get in 7 minutes. So that's all right, unless there's any other anecdotes you wanted to share before we jump to that.
No, I just think one of the things that's worth talking about, there's a book called Winning on Purpose by Fred Heldrich, I think it is. And this guy talks about, companies that chase profit, and they are in a relentless, pursuit of the bottom line. They are short-term companies at the end of the day, right? And it's those customer-obsessed companies. It's those those companies that focus on customers. He drew correlation between customer-obsessed companies and how they performed on the stock market over 20 years. And then he took the ones that focus on the bottom line and tracked their stock market performance over 20 years. And the customer-obsessed companies beat the profit-obsessed companies hands down, because you make people sticky, you build up brand loyalty, you build up customers by focusing on them, and that is your ultimate bottom line. And I think it's a point worth taking away. So when you're challenged by leadership, when you're challenged around, is it the customer, is it profit? I think that's a really, it's worth taking away.
Yeah, that's great to hear. So yeah, we'll take it to questions. If anyone has, anything that you're curious about or even want to share, we'll pass the mic around or throw it. I don't know, it looks spongy. Maybe we can throw it. We can keep sharing anecdotes if there's nothing, but I was told you're supposed to always wait at least 7 seconds in this scenario. I don't know why, so I'm going to just do that. You'll see how long 7 seconds actually feels.
These lights are so strong, we can just sit here getting a tan.
Yeah, that's true.
It's kind of nice.
And I think, just one other thing. I think one of the things that people, in terms of strategy and in terms of, hitting the mark with your stakeholders, don't think of the person you're delivering a deliverable to, right? Think of the person that they're going to take your deliverable and they're going to communicate it to, right? And I think that was probably the biggest lesson I learned, because if you start thinking of not the person above you or your direct stakeholder, but their direct stakeholder and the person they are going to communicate it to, you have a much better chance of making your deliverable resonate, okay? And I think the moment that I started doing that, thinking, okay, I'm not delivering to my boss, I'm delivering to his boss. So how do I make this deliverable easy for my boss to communicate to his boss? And then I think that it gives you a high success rate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, or even if you're talking to a stakeholder who needs to present something to a customer base, or a launch event, whatever it is, how are we going to talk about this aspect of it, or how would you? And changing that frame a little bit is a good way to kind of bring up some more conversation. That's a good one.
Do you want to hear a story about where the customer wasn't part of a major change in an organization?
I love stories.
Okay, I have 3 minutes, so I'll talk fast, okay? So back in the 90s, I was in Dundalk College, actually, which is, for you, is on the border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, no man's land, basically, right? And at that time, I wasn't really going to college much. Like most young college students, I was spending most of the time in the pub. But I was also working on this tool called Mardi, which I can't remember the name of it, but it was basically an agile requirements tool for distributed teams. And this guy from Silicon Valley didn't know what Silicon Valley was. Don't know what was it called Silicon Valley back there, whatever it's called, Mountain View or something like that. And this guy turned up and I was dragged in to give him a demo of the product because I think I was the only one doing something like that. And he invited me over anyway. If I was younger, I think he was a paedophile, but he wasn't. He brought me over. So off I went. Then the first morning I was up at 6:30, hadn't been up that early in a long time. Was invited into a Great Western hotel, which you'd know pretty well. They always smell like nursing homes, you know those ones? Brought me into a room and said, sit in the corner here and just be quiet. And I don't blame him, as you can probably tell from the amount of time I spent talking today. But so I was looking around the room and I recognised one guy, and then there was a woman who was about, I'd say, a year younger than me, and I was pretty young back then. I was actually in my early 20s. And then there was 2 people in suits. One of them was definitely an auditor, like you could see them a mile away. And then 3 other people in it. And basically people started making presentations, and the first presentation was basically about this community tool, because Facebook was really big at the time, and we need to create a community about our user group. And I still didn't know what company it was at the time. Then this lady got up, and she was very impressive, and she still is a very impressive woman, and she started talking about a recommendation engine, and she was like, look, we're about to default on our commitments to our investors, and the DVD market isn't working for us anymore, we need to move into something else. And ultimately I managed to sit through the first presentation of the Netflix recommendation tool, and it was all from the perspective of we're about to die as a company. And it's really interesting what happens when you put that type of pressure on an organization. And here's me going, I'd never even heard of Netflix at that stage. Now, I was in Harvard later and I learned lots about them, but it was an amazing moment where really cultivated the thinking of, it's not always customers that drive that pressure into your organization to make new decisions. Sometimes how shitty the organization is itself. And I remember when I met my CEO, when I joined the company first, I asked him what his legacy was, and he gave me the political answer, so I had to ask him again 6 months later, and I got the real answer out of him. I won't say his name, but you can probably look it up on the website. Very good CEO, by the way, excellent guy. But it was a similar kind of thing. You know, we're an Asian-owned parent company, large power distance relationship, massively profitable, because if anyone knows private equity, it's all about asset value, and asset value is on the basis of having really low operating costs and really high revenue streams. And he spoke a lot about this, is where, you know, hearing no in an organization and then trying to find new innovative ways to still make it happen. And that's why I talked about entrepreneurial vocation in a corporate environment, because you need that. And having the resilience to see that through can sometimes be equally as important as a customer focus group, or having a really objective viewpoint of what your customers are talking about out there. There you go, there's a story for you.
Yeah, well, I love that Netflix, I mean, that's wild that you got to hear that, because I love that example in general as a company that had to make a massive change in what they were doing. And that seems like a hard thing to do, especially if you're in the hundreds of your employees that are all of a sudden like seeing that number tank, debating if this is a company that's going to last. I don't have an MBA, but I was told that a lot of the things they teach you are about building lasting cultures, because markets change so quickly, especially now, and because change in general in the world happens so often. I think about this a lot with like AI and design and things like that all the time, and the lasting companies will probably be the ones that know how to make these big pivots and shifts when their profit is tanking or when their market is tanking. And I think that's really inspiring when it can happen, and it does require like a different kind of skill set. It's not just like, you know, how do you make a great mock-up or present nicely in a room? It's like, how do you pivot to an entirely different world with over 100 employees or whatever at once? I have a lot of respect for companies that have done that. We are, I think, at time or over time a little bit, so sorry that we won't have time to get to the 1 or 2 questions that might have existed somewhere. But thank you so much for tuning in, and thanks so much for our panelists. One round of applause for everyone.